There is a ring around the moon tonight. To most people, that is just a pretty sight hanging over the rooftops. To a frontier family living out on the open prairie in the 1800s, that pale ring of light was a warning that rain or snow was coming within a day, and they would plan their entire week around it. The sky was talking, the animals were talking, even the pine cones sitting on the windowsill were talking. And the people who survived out there learned how to listen, because getting it wrong meant getting caught in the open when the weather turned deadly. This story does not really start with that ring around the moon. It starts with a kind of literacy that almost nobody carries anymore. The ability to look at the sky, the smoke, the birds, and the plants in your own yard and read tomorrow's weather off them like words on a page. For most of human history, that skill was the only forecast anyone had. Nobody had a radar map glowing on a screen or a phone buzzing with a storm alert, and there was no meteorologist on a television pointing at a wall of clouds. If you lived on the frontier, a sudden storm could flatten your crops, scatter your livestock across miles of grassland, or catch you out in the open with nowhere to hide. Out on the northern plains, a blizzard could roll in behind a clear morning and turn deadly within hours. So people learned to watch. They watched closely, every single day, and they passed what they noticed down to their children in little rhyming sayings that turned out to be a lot more accurate than they sound. The first place a settler looked was always Oop, and the most reliable warning the sky ever gave came in the form of thin, wispy clouds streaking high overhead. These are the clouds we now call cirrus, and the old-timers called them mare's tails because they curl at the ends like the tail of a running horse. When those high streaks started moving in across an otherwise clear blue sky, it meant a warm front was approaching, and rain was usually somewhere between 1 and 2 days out. That gave a farmer time to bring in hay, finish a harvest, or stock the woodpile before the weather closed in. The ring around the moon worked on the same principle. That pale halo forms when light passes through a thin, high sheet of ice crystal cloud called cirrostratus, the kind of cloud that runs out ahead of an incoming storm system. Think about that for a second. People looking up at a clear, calm night, seeing nothing but a ring of light around the moon, and confidently telling their neighbors that rain was coming tomorrow. They were usually right. Then there's the saying almost everyone still knows. Red sky at night, sailors delight. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. That rhyme rests on real physics. In most of North America and Europe, weather systems travel from west to east. A glowing red sunset means the setting sun in the west is shining through clear, dry air that's heading your way, so fair weather is on its way in. A deep red sunrise means that clear air has already passed you to the east, and the light is catching the moisture and cloud of a system moving in from the west. The morning sky was warning sailors and farmers alike that rougher weather was coming. There was one more sky sign that put people on edge, a pattern of small, rippling clouds that looked like fish scales spread across the blue. Sailors called it a mackerel sky, and they paired it with the mare's tails in a single warning. Mackerel sky and mare's tails make tall ships carry low sails. When both showed up together, experienced eyes knew the calm wouldn't last, and they prepared for wind and rain inside of a day. And the sky kept updating its forecast as the day went on. Those high, thin clouds would gradually lower and thicken into a flat gray sheet, and the higher and thinner they started, the more lead time you had. By the time the clouds dropped low and turned heavy and dark across the horizon, the warning was over and the storm had basically arrived. A skilled reader watched not just what the clouds were, but how fast they were changing. But the sky was only one source. The smartest weather readers paid just as much attention to the air itself, the things you could feel and smells long before a single cloud appeared. You've probably noticed that the world smells different right before it rains. That earthy, heavy scent rising off the ground is real, and frontier families used it. As air pressure falls ahead of a storm, the ground releases trapped scents and gases, and moist air carries those smells farther and makes them stronger. The same thing happens with sound. On the morning before a storm, distant noises seem to carry from miles away. A train whistle, a church bell, a neighbor's dog, all suddenly crisp and close. That's moist, heavy air, and a layer of warmer air overhead bending the sound back down toward the ground. When the far hills suddenly sounded near, people knew the pressure was dropping. Smoke told the same story in a way anyone could see. On a fair, high-pressure day, smoke from a chimney or a campfire rises straight up into the air. When a storm system moves in and the pressure drops, that smoke starts to hang low, curling back down and drifting across the yard instead of climbing. A settler glancing at the wood smoke over the farmhouse could read the pressure without ever owning a barometer. Some folks swore their own bodies were instruments too. Old injuries would ache, joints would stiffen, and people insisted they could feel a storm coming in their bones. The science there is shakier, and plenty of it is just memory playing tricks, but falling pressure does have real effects on the body, and a person who'd been reading the weather their whole life trusted what they felt. The wind carried information too, and a good reader paid attention to where it came from and which way it was shifting. An old rule held that a wind from the west brought the best weather. A wind swinging around to the east meant trouble was on its way. In much of the country, that rule held up, because a wind shifting against the sun and turning slowly counterclockwise often signals a low-pressure system moving in. A farmer who felt the breeze swing from a dry westerly to a damp easterly through the course of a morning had real reason to expect rain by nightfall. The ground gave its own quiet answer at dawn. A heavy coating of DW on the grass meant the night sky had stayed clear and calm, which usually promised another fair day. A dry morning with no dew at all hinted that clouds had moved in overnight and rain might follow. Some families even kept a length of rope or a braid of seaweed by the door as a homemade humidity gauge, since both pull tight and feel damp when the moisture in the air climbs ahead of a storm. If you're enjoying this walk through the lost art of reading the weather, take a second to subscribe, because I dig into forgotten frontier skills like this every single week. Now let's talk about the animals, because this is where the real skill shows up. Animals feel a storm coming long before we do, and they can't hide it. Their behavior changes, and a sharp eye could read those changes like a barometer with a heartbeat. The classic example is birds flying low. Before a storm, you'll often see swallows and other small birds skimming low over a field or a pond instead of soaring high. Here's the detail most people miss about why. As pressure drops and the air grows humid, the tiny insects that birds eat can't fly as high, so they stay close to the ground, and the birds simply follow their food down. Those low-flying swallows over a wheat field were a sign that the insects had dropped, and the insects had dropped because the storm was near. Bees did something similar. On a fair day, a hive sends its workers out far and wide, but in the hours before rain, the bees come home and stay home. A beekeeper who noticed the hive going quiet and the workers clustering at the entrance knew to expect a change. Cattle and horses grew restless and bunched together, often crowding into the corner of a field or turning their backs to the direction the weather was coming from. Frogs grew noticeably louder before rain, croaking through the evening because the damp, humid air suited them. Even the insects on the ground joined in. Ants would often build up the mounds around their nest entrances and grow visibly busier before rain, sealing things up against the coming wet. Spiders gave a quieter signal worth watching. Before a stretch of fine, dry weather, they spin large, ambitious webs and keep them in good repair. But as humidity rises ahead of a storm, they tend to tear their webs down or abandon them entirely. A morning with no fresh webs across the garden gate was a small hint that the air was changing. Now, not every animal sign held up. The old belief that cows always lie down before it rains is one of those sayings that sounds wise and mostly doesn't hold up. Cows lie down for all sorts of reasons, mostly just to rest and chew, so a field full of resting cattle told you very little. The experienced weather reader knew the difference between a sign with a real cause behind it and a piece of barnyard folklore, and that judgment is exactly what separated a good forecast from a lucky guess. Even the plants growing around the cabin were keeping watch, and a few of them were good enough at it to earn nicknames. The pine cone is the most reliable of all. A pine cone sitting on a windowsill will open its scales wide in dry weather, and it will pull them tightly closed when the air turns damp. That comes down to the structure of the cone itself, which responds to moisture the same way a wooden door swells and sticks in a humid summer. Since the air grows humid ahead of rain, a cone that suddenly clamped shut was a genuine physical warning that wet weather was on the way. Flowers played the same trick. There is a small scarlet wildflower so good at this that people called it the poor man's weather glass because it folds its petals closed when humidity climbs before a storm and opens them again in fair, dry air. Dandelions and tulips do something similar. And then there were the trees. When a gusty wind shifts ahead of a front, it flips the leaves of certain trees so their pale undersides show all at once across the whole canopy. When the maples turned their backs to you and showed their silver, an old rhyme warned that rain was on its way, and more often than not, it arrived. Here's the part that really explains how any of this worked. No single one of these signs was ever trusted on its own. A ring around the moon by itself might mean nothing. A few low-flying birds on their own could just be hungry birds. What made frontier weather reading genuinely reliable was stacking the signs together. When the mare's tails crept in overhead, and the smoke from the chimney started hanging low, and the swallows dropped to the field, and the pine cone on the sill pulled shut, all on the same afternoon, that stopped being a coincidence. That was 4 different instruments, all reading the same falling pressure and rising humidity at once. And a person who saw all 4 knew with real confidence that a storm was coming. Pay attention to that, because it explains everything. These people were reading the land like a set of instruments. They were running a kind of analog weather station spread across the whole landscape, and they learned to read every dial at the same time. That's also why the knowledge was so hard to fake. You couldn't memorize one clever rhyme and call yourself a weather reader. You had to know your own patch of sky, your own animals, and your own land well enough to notice when several small things changed together. Almost none of this stopped being true. The physics behind the red morning sky, the falling pressure, the ice crystal halo, and the humid air closing a pine cone are exactly the same today as they were 200 years ago. The signs are still there, drifting across the sky and rising off the ground every single day. We've just stopped looking, because the forecast lives in our pockets now, and there is no survival reason to watch the swallows. Sailors and pilots and farmers who work outdoors still use a lot of these signs today, right alongside their radar and their apps, because a sky you can see with your own eyes never loses signal and never runs out of battery. So the next time you step outside and notice a pale ring around the moon, or catch that heavy smell of rain on the air before a single cloud shows up, you're reading the same signals a frontier family would have staked their harvest on. The sky is still talking. Most of us just forgot the language. So tonight, look up. If there is a ring around that moon, you already know what tomorrow might bring, and you will have learned it the same way the pioneers did, with nothing but your own 2 eyes and a little patience. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you'd like to continue watching more of my videos on frontier skills, you can click the video on the screen now.